Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Unseen Wisdom. Make sure you hit that like button, comment below, and subscribe so you don't miss any of our deep dives.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's jump right in. There's been a ton of talk about TikTok and potentially getting banned in the US.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, that's a big deal on its own. But what's really fascinating to me is how some users are reacting. It's totally unexpected, almost like they're rebelling against the whole idea of the ban.
Mm-hmm.
So to unpack all of this, I've got our expert here with us, who, as always, can see those patterns and connections that most of us miss.
I try.
What I'm really curious about, and what I think we should really dive into, is what does this all mean? Not just for TikTok, but for the future of social media, data security, and even, international relations.
Yeah.
Like, how does this all play into the dynamics between the U.S. and China?
It's a tangled web we're looking at here. So you've got this looming deadline set by federal law that's essentially forcing TikTok to be sold to an American company or face a nationwide block.
Right, and that deadline is coming up fast. But what's so intriguing is that even with all these concerns about data security and, the possibility of the Chinese government having some kind of influence, some users are actually turning to other Chinese-owned apps.
It's fascinating. It's just that people aren't really as worried about the data security aspect as we might think.
Yeah.
Or at least they're not seeing it as something that's unique to TikTok.
Exactly. Like Red Note is suddenly, topping these download charts.
Mm-hmm.
And Lemonade, which is owned by the same parent company as TikTok, ByteDance, is also gaining traction. It just seems almost like a deliberate act of defiance.
It does. And it makes you wonder, what does that say about how people just perceive data privacy these days? Are they just resigned to the fact that, their data is already being collected no matter what? Or is there something else going on?
Yeah, it might be a trust issue. I mean, even US-based alternatives like, YouTube Shorts, they collect tons of user data too.
They do.
So why aren't people as concerned about that?
That's a really good question. And I think that gets to the heart of this whole debate. Is this really about national security, or are there other political and economic factors at play here? Because this situation has massive implications for both the U.S. and China.
Yeah, their relationship is already pretty complicated.
Yeah.
It's kind of like they're frenemies.
Yeah.
Cooperating on some things, competing fiercely on others.
Exactly. And this TikTok situation just adds another layer of complexity to it all. You have the U.S. that's concerned about China's growing technological influence and the potential for data being used for things like, disinformation campaigns. But then on the other hand, you have China that views this as an attempt by the U.S. to stifle their tech companies and maintain dominance.
So it's like this tug of war with data privacy and national security on one side and economic competition and international relations on the other.
Precisely. And it's hard to see how this plays out without some serious consequences.
Okay, so let's say this ban actually does go through. What does that really mean for the U.S.? Is it really about protecting user data, or is there something else going on, a bigger game at play?
Well, on the surface, the U.S. government's argument is about data security. They're concerned about TikTok's Chinese ownership and the potential for the Chinese government to access that data, which could be used for anything from surveillance to spreading propaganda.
I've definitely seen reports about that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard to know how much of that is real and how much of that is hype. Because U.S. companies, they collect tons of data too.
Right.
So it seems a little, I don't know, inconsistent.
You're hitting on a key point. The U.S. government hasn't really given a clear explanation as to why they're more concerned about data in the hands of a Chinese company versus, say, a Google or a Facebook.
Yeah, that's what I find confusing. So what is the real story here?
Well, some argue that it's part of a broader strategy to contain China's growing technological and economic power. They see TikTok as a symbol of China's rise, and they want to limit its reach, even if it means sacrificing some degree of, freedom and open access to information.
So it's more about geopolitics than it is about actual data privacy.
It's hard to say for sure, but it's certainly a factor. The U.S. and China are in this battle for global dominance, and technology is a major front in that battle. The TikTok ban could be seen as a way for the U.S. to assert dominance and kind of slow down China's progress.
Wow, so this goes way deeper than just a social media app.
It does.
We're talking about the future of the internet, a balance of power between these two superpowers, and potentially a whole new era of digital conflict.
Exactly. And the stakes are incredibly high. This could set a precedent for how governments around the world regulate technology, control information, which should have a ripple effect on everything from free speech to international trade.
Okay, so We've talked about what this could mean for the U.S., but
Yeah.
what about China? How are they likely to react to all of this?
Well, they're definitely not happy about it. They see it as protectionism and an attempt to stifle their innovation. They've accused the U.S. of hypocrisy, pointing out that U.S. companies like Facebook and Google have faced their own share of data privacy scandals.
And they've got a point there.
Right.
But isn't China also known for its own strict internet censorship and control?
Absolutely. They have a very different model of internet governance, one that prioritizes control and stability over individual freedom. So there's definitely a clash of values here.
So what happens next? Does this escalate into like a full-blown tech war between the U.S. and China?
That's a real possibility. China could retaliate by targeting U.S. tech companies that are operating in China or by restricting access to key technologies or resources. And that could have serious consequences for both economies and the global tech industry.
So it's a lose-lose situation.
Not necessarily. There's still a chance for diplomacy and cooperation. Both countries have a really strong incentive to find a solution that addresses their concerns without, causing too much disruption. But it's going to require some careful negotiation and a willingness to compromise.
Okay, so what would a solution even look like? Is there a way to balance these competing interests of national security, data privacy, economic competition, and freedom of information?
That's the million-dollar question, and I don't have all the answers, but I think one possible path forward would be to establish some kind of international agreement on data privacy standards.
So instead of each country having its own set of rules, there would be like a global framework that everyone has to adhere to.
Exactly. That would level the playing field and ensure a baseline level of protection for user data and hopefully reduce the potential for these types of conflicts in the future.
That sounds like a good idea, but is it realistic? Would countries like China, with their own approach to internet governance, be willing to sign on to something like that?
It's a long shot for sure, but I think it's worth exploring. The alternative is a fragmented internet with different countries having their own walled gardens, their own rules, and their own versions of reality. And that's a recipe for mistrust, conflict, and ultimately a less free and interconnected world.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from a potential TikTok ban to a potential tech war between the U.S. and China. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, to be honest. What are the key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with from this part of our deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to understand that this isn't just about one app or even one country. It's about the future of technology, the balance of power in the world, and those fundamental values that we hold dear. It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's one that we all need to be thinking about and engaging with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is a story that's still unfolding, and it's going to have a major impact on all our lives, whether we use TikTok or not. So I'd encourage everyone listening to stay informed, stay curious, and stay engaged, because the choices we make today will shape the world we live in tomorrow. We'll be back in a moment to continue our deep dive into this fascinating and complex issue.
This whole TikTok situation, it really has me thinking about how we talk about data privacy as this individual choice,
Right.
It's something we can control, but is it really that simple? What if the systems we use are basically designed to make, real privacy almost impossible?
I see what you mean. It's like those terms and conditions agreements that are pages long and written in this language that only lawyers can understand. Most of us just click agree without even thinking about it.
Exactly. We're constantly making these micro decisions about our data without even realizing it. And, those decisions that can have huge consequences.
So what are we supposed to do? Give up our smartphones and go live off the grid?
Well, that's one option, but it's not really practical for most people. I think the key here is to demand more transparency and control over our data. We need to push for stronger regulations that hold companies accountable for how they collect, store, and use our information.
I agree with holding companies accountable. But how do we even know what's happening behind the scenes? It's like a black box.
Yeah, that's a huge part of the problem. Companies often use really obscure language and complex algorithms that make it really difficult for users to understand how their data is actually being used.
It's almost like they're doing it on purpose, right? To make it so complicated that we just give up.
It's a cynical view, but I wouldn't say it's entirely unfounded.
So what's the solution then? Do we all have to become tech experts to protect our privacy?
Well, ideally, yeah. But again, that's just not realistic for most people. We need to advocate for simpler, more user-friendly ways to manage our data preferences. Imagine if you could easily see what data an app is collecting, why they need it, how they're using it. And what if you could easily opt out of certain types of data collection, or even delete your data altogether?
That would be amazing.
That's right.
But is that too much to ask from these companies? I mean, they're making so much money from our data.
True, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing. There are ways to balance, the interests of companies with the rights of individuals.
So we need to find ways to, like, incentivize companies to actually prioritize data privacy, whether it's through regulations or consumer pressure or a combination of both.
Exactly. And this is where the conversation gets even more complex.
Before you go.
Because remember, this whole TikTok ban is happening at a time when tensions are already rising between the U.S. and China.
Right. This isn't just about data privacy anymore. It's also about geopolitics, economic competition, and even national security.
It's all connected, and it's really difficult to separate those legitimate concerns about national security from all the other geopolitical stuff that's happening.
So how do we make sure that we're not just, reacting to all the headlines and fear-mongering, but actually having a thoughtful conversation about the real issues at play?
That's the question we all need to be asking. It's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric and those emotional responses, but it's important to step back and try to understand just how complex this all is.
So we need to be critical thinkers, right?
Okay.
Especially when it comes to something as sensitive as data privacy and national security.
Absolutely. We need to question those assumptions, consider different perspectives, and be willing to have those open and honest conversations, even if they make us a little uncomfortable.
Okay, but let's be real here. Not everyone's interested in having these conversations. Some people just want to scroll through their For You page and not think about data privacy or international relations.
And that's perfectly valid.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that these issues affect everyone, even if they don't realize it.
Because even if you don't personally use TikTok, the decisions being made about this ban could set precedents that affect the entire internet, which affects us all.
Exactly. This isn't just about one app. It's about the future of technology, our relationship with information, and even the balance of power globally.
Okay, so we've established that this is a big deal with some serious implications.
Yeah.
But what does it actually mean for the U.S. and China?
Well, that's a question that experts have been grappling with for years now. On the one hand, you have this potential for economic decoupling, meaning that the two countries could become less reliant on each other for trade and investment. It's been happening gradually for a while now, but the TikTok situation could speed that process up significantly.
And that could really impact the global economy, right?
For sure, it could lead to higher prices for consumers, disruptions in supply chains, and even job losses.
So there are economic downsides for both countries if they keep going down this path of decoupling.
Yes, but there are also potential upsides.
Such as?
Well, for the U.S., decoupling from China could create more opportunities to develop their own domestic industries and create jobs, in sectors like manufacturing and technology.
So it's about bringing jobs back home and reducing that reliance on foreign supply chains.
Exactly. And for China, decoupling could present more opportunities for them to develop their own innovations and rely less on Western markets.
So both countries are trying to sort of one-up each other in this tech race.
Yes, and that's where things get even more complicated.
I'm sensing a pattern here.
Because this competition isn't limited to the economic sphere, it's playing out in the military and security realms as well.
Right. I've seen reports about China's military capabilities and their ambitions in the South China Sea.
And in response, the U.S. is strengthening its alliances in the region and increasing its military presence.
So are we heading towards another Cold War?
That term gets used a lot, but it's not a perfect analogy. The situation today is much more complex. The two countries are deeply intertwined economically, and they also cooperate on some issues like climate change and global health.
So it's not like this simple good versus evil story like during the Cold War. It's a much more complicated relationship.
Exactly. And that makes finding solutions a lot more challenging.
Because anything one country does is going to provoke a reaction from the other, right?
Right. And that could easily escalate in a way that helps no one.
Okay, so we've got this complicated mix of data privacy, economic competition, and geopolitical tensions. It feels like we're standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong step could send us over.
It's a precarious situation for sure, but I also think it's an opportunity.
An opportunity in the middle of all this uncertainty and conflict.
Yes, because it's forcing us to confront some really fundamental questions about, the role of technology in our lives, the balance of power, and even our own values.
I see what you mean. It's like a wake-up call, making us pay attention to the things we've been taking for granted.
Exactly. And if we can approach these challenges with open minds and a willingness to find common ground, I think we can come out of this stronger and more resilient.
Okay, I'm trying to stay optimistic here, but I have to ask, what's the best case scenario in all of this?
Well, in the best case scenario, the US and China would find a way to manage their differences and cooperate on issues that benefit both of them. They could work together to establish global norms and standards for data privacy and cybersecurity and find ways to foster healthy competition without resorting to protectionism or aggression.
That sounds pretty idealistic.
It is, but it's important to have a vision for the future, even if it seems far off.
So we have to aim high and strive for a world where technology empowers people, promotes peace, and protects our planet.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
But what about the worst case scenario? Because let's face it, things could go south pretty quickly.
True. In a worst-case scenario, this TikTok ban could escalate into a wider trade war. Tensions could rise in the South China Sea, potentially leading to military conflict, and the global internet could become more fragmented. Different countries could end up with their own versions of the web, with their own rules and censorship.
That sounds bleak.
It is, and it's important to be aware of those potential consequences, both individually and collectively.
We all need to be more aware of the choices we're making, both in terms of, the apps we use and the leaders we elect.
Exactly. Our decisions have real-world consequences, and it's important to take that responsibility seriously.
Okay, so we've laid out the best and worst case scenarios.
Yeah.
But what's the most likely outcome here?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it's still too early to say for sure, but there are definitely some trends worth watching.
Like what?
Well, I think the trend towards, greater awareness of data privacy is here to stay. People are becoming more aware of how their information is being used and are demanding more control over it.
So companies are going to have to adapt to that and find ways to build trust with their users.
For sure. And I think this trend towards more geopolitical competition between the US and China, that's likely to continue as well. This is going to have major implications for everything, from trade to technology to security.
So it sounds like we're in for a bit of a bumpy ride. We need to buckle up and be ready for anything.
I agree, but I also think there's reason for hope. Because even with all this uncertainty, I'm seeing more and more people who are demanding a better future. A future where technology is a force for good data privacy is respected, and international relations are built on cooperation, not conflict.
That's a powerful vision. It's definitely worth fighting for.
Absolutely, and it's one that's going to require all of us to step up, to educate ourselves and hold our leaders accountable.
So what can our listeners do to make a difference?
That's a great question. There are so many ways to get involved, even if you're not a tech expert or an activist. You can start by just being more mindful of your own data privacy.
Like reading all those terms and conditions?
Well, you can try, but even I have trouble understanding those sometimes. There are simpler things you can do, like adjust your privacy settings on your devices and be more selective about the apps you use.
So it's all about being more aware of the choices we're making and taking steps to protect our own privacy.
Right. You can also support organizations that are promoting data privacy and digital rights.
Like the Electronic Frontier Foundation or Access Now.
Those are great examples. And you can always reach out to your elected officials and let them know that data privacy is important to you.
So make our voices heard and demand that our leaders actually prioritize these issues.
Exactly. Every voice makes a difference, and together we can build a better future.
Love that. Okay, so we've covered a lot today, but there's one more piece of the puzzle I want to talk about. We've talked about the potential bans, the data privacy concerns, and all the geopolitical stuff. But what about the human cost?
That's an important point. We often forget about the real people who are affected by these decisions.
Exactly. Like behind all the headlines and the political debates, there are real people whose lives are being turned upside down.
Yeah, think about the creators on TikTok who rely on that platform to make a living.
Right. A lot of them have built their entire careers around TikTok. If that app disappears, they could lose everything.
It's a tough situation to be in, for sure. And then you have all the users who rely on TikTok for connection and entertainment, even education.
Yeah, especially during those times of isolation, like during the pandemic, TikTok became a lifeline for so many people.
Right. It gave them a sense of community and a way to stay connected with the world.
So taking that away, even if it's with good intentions, can really impact people's well-being.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that, technology isn't just about, the technical stuff. It's about people.
Yeah, and the choices we make about technology, they can have a huge impact on people's lives.
No doubt about it.
Okay, so as we try to navigate this whole world of technology and data privacy and, all these international tensions, let's not forget about the human side of things.
I agree.
Let's consider how our actions impact others. And let's work towards a future where, technology helps us, empowers us, and brings us together, rather than dividing us or controlling us.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, so I think we've officially reached peak brain capacity for one episode. But before we go, I want to leave everyone with one final thought. We've talked a lot about the risks of technology, but let's not forget about the incredible potential it has for good.
Definitely.
Technology can connect us with people from all over the world. It can give a voice to those who've been silenced, and it can help us tackle some of the world's biggest problems.
It's a powerful tool, and it's really up to us how we use it.
Exactly. So let's be thoughtful, let's be critical, but let's also be hopeful, because the future isn't set in stone. It's up to us to shape it.
I believe that we can create a future where technology works for everyone and not the other way around.
That's a great point.
Wow.
I think it's time for us to take a break and process all this information, but we'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, stay curious.